And I'm joined, whoops. Thanks, Emily, for recording. So I'm joined by Patrick Goggin. He's also with our Extension Lakes team out of Rhinelander, and Patrick has a wealth of experience with gardening along shorelines and shoreline management. So he'll be talking in the second part of the webinar today.
Hey, Paul, you're on mute.
Paul, you're on mute.
Was I muted that whole time?
No, last like 20 seconds or so.
Oh, okay. Somebody must have tried to mute somebody else and got me instead. I was saying that Patrick Goggin is here as well. He's from our Extension Lakes team out of Rhinelander, and he brings a wealth of knowledge on shoreline management. So he'll be talking during the second part of the webinar today. And we also have Emily Heald and Katie Bradford from the Water Action Volunteers program. They're kind of behind the scenes today, watching the chat and facilitating the Q&A for us today.
I had to allow Zoom to record.
Sounds like there's a few people that aren't muted yet, so go ahead and mute your microphones, please, if you could, so we can minimize background noise. Thank you. All right. This webinar is being recorded, so we're going to post it to the Extension Lakes YouTube channel. You can also use the chat function today.
No, it's talking. I muted myself.
Ask questions in the chat window today. Katie and Emily will be watching that and can bring some questions forward to us. We're going to hold most of the questions until the end, unless there's a real quick question like what color or what's the purple flower that you showed on the last slide, that sort of a question. The majority of them will hold till the end. And just a quick note about next month's webinar on January 18th, we'll be talking about Wisconsin semi-aquatic fur bearers with Jamie Knack from UW-Madison Division of Extension. If you've been watching the Citizen Lake Monitoring webinars for a few years now, we did have one on fur bearers a couple of years ago with Shelley Dubé from UW-Stevens Point. That was more focused on the economics of fur bearers, and this is going to be more natural history type stuff on fur bearers. So if you're interested in that, join us on the 18th of January. All right, so let's get started here with rain gardens. Everybody's seeing my slide okay, right?
Yes.
All right, awesome. So rain gardens are an amazing, dynamic and multifunctional garden. This is actually in front of my house right here, my own rain garden, and you can see the water coming out of the downspout, hitting some rocks, and then slowly filtering and seeping its way down into the rain garden. And it does hold water for a short period of time. In my case, it holds water for about 20 minutes or so after a heavy rainstorm. So it soaks in pretty well. But I really like rain gardens because of all the different functions that they can do all at once, and we'll get into that here in part one. So we have a lot of issues facing Wisconsin lakes and streams. We have all kinds of nutrient issues and pollutants that are getting into not only surface water, but in the groundwater as well. We have groundwater quantity issues in some parts of the state, certainly worse in some years than others. We have erosion and sedimentation that can smother spawning habitat and cause nutrient releases and other issues. We have wildlife habitat decreasing around lake shores and along streams, and then, of course, the wildlife themselves decreasing as well because they don't have habitat. We have algae blooms, we have bacterial levels and no swimming signs going up and goose abundance issues, all these things that are caused by things that are happening mostly on the land. We sometimes see lakes that look like this. This is a southern Wisconsin lake where blue-green algae blooms get to a really high level, and this is considered a harmful algal bloom. These are toxic blue-green algae here, and the lake turns into like a layer of green paint on the top. It's not good to be around or touch that water. So we don't like to see that. Most of these problems, as I said, reflect problems on the surrounding land rather than problems within the water itself. This illustration here shows a comparison between a developed shoreline and an undeveloped shoreline. And a typical Wisconsin lake, especially in northern Wisconsin lake, we have a lot of forested watershed around these lakes. And when that situation is around the lakes, that allows precipitation to fall on various zones of vegetation before it reaches the ground. And as those raindrops hit a tree or they hit a shrub or the ground layer, it takes a lot of the energy away from that rain. So it doesn't hit the ground and create a divot or a gully, washing soil out of place on the landscape. It kind of cushions the fall of those raindrops, and it allows for the soil on that site to remain fluffy and loose, and the raindrops can soak right in and go into the groundwater table instead of flowing across a compacted landscape down into the lakes or the streams or the wetlands downslope. When we develop a piece of land along a lakeshore, we often flatten it out, we compact it because of all the machinery, and often a lot of the trees and shrubs are cleared. Much of the herbaceous layer on the ground is cleared as well, and often replaced with turf grasses. And what this does is really increase the ability of water to just flow across the land instead of seeping down into the groundwater and getting filtered in that process. We would rather see the groundwater moving toward the lakes and streams and wetlands and contributing clean, filtered water into those systems instead of dirty surface water running across the land, picking up fertilizers and pesticides and dog waste and motor oil and all these other pollutants that are on the landscape, and just delivering them straight to our water bodies. So as I said, this can come from a variety of sources. It could be
Now I'll get this shut off.
various pollutants on the ground. It could be from your rooftop. It could be car byproducts that are on the driveway. Any of these things will eventually make their way toward these lakes and streams and wetlands, especially where there's a steep slope, as you see in this picture here. So what we really need is some kind of a barrier there, or a depression on the landscape that can contain a bunch of that stormwater and allow it to soak into the ground before it reaches the water body. The United States Environmental Protection Agency did a study on water pollution and looked at stormwater runoff and found that stormwater runoff was carrying 70% of all the water pollution impacting our waterways. They also looked at rain gardens as a way to mitigate that impact, and they found that over 90% of the pollutants in stormwater can be removed by a functioning rain garden system. So you can really help out your local lake or stream or your community by capturing your own property's stormwater on site instead of allowing that to run directly into a lake or stream. So how can we do that? One way is through a rain garden. A rain garden is something that could be built in a natural low-lying area on a landscape, or it could be an engineered area, something that you dug out and created your own low spot. The idea is to capture the water and allow it to soak into the ground instead of letting it run over the land directly into a lake, directly into a stream, into a storm sewer that then likely feeds directly into a lake or stream. We want to contain that water and let it slowly soak into the ground. It also decreases erosion by decreasing the water flowing across the soil particles, decreases the pollution and the volume of stormwater, increases water quality downstream, and also can moderate stream flow so we don't have such a high peak flood event and then a drought event and then another peak flood event. It'd be nice if we had a more moderate stream flow where floods and droughts were not as having as much of an impact. These are generally located at least 10 feet away from a structure. You don't want a lot of water concentrate rule, and you want to make sure that the other end of the rain garden is also sloped away from the house. So if it does fill up all the way, you don't want it backing up toward the house. You want it to go the other direction. And these rain gardens are filled with native plants to encourage infiltration and absorb pollutants that are in the stormwater. Native plants are excellent choices for this, and I'll get into many of the reasons for that in a minute here. And another side benefit, if you have a wet basement issue, a rain garden can be a really powerful tool in reducing the amount of moisture in your basement. So case in point, this is my old basement, and we had a really wet wall issue down there. Every time it rained, within 18 hours, the wall would be wet, it'd be dripping and running across the floor. And when we had a basement contractor come and look at this, he gave us a quote for $9,900 filters to jackhammer a dehumidifier system and all this other stuff. And I decided I was going to try to address the real problem first. Where is this water coming from and how's it getting here? And we used a combination of rain barrels and rain gardens. And we ended up having that problem completely solved. We didn't have to do anything other than the rain gardens and the rain barrels. We never had a wet wall issue again. We cleaned it up, we painted the floor, never had a problem with that water again. The problem was it was concentrating too much around the house and it was getting into the foundation. So on one corner of the house, we had the downspout going right into this blue rain barrel. We had a 2-inch overflow pipe that carried water under the walkway here and along the side of the path. And then it went down to a rain garden about 35 feet away. And I'll show you a picture of that in a second here. But I did want to illustrate that you can use underground piping if you want to deliver water to a rain garden without having a downspout extension or something that you have to move and lift up when you mow the grass, then anything like that. You can also go underground if you've got the slope for that. And some municipalities do offer tax credits for these things. So you may find that a rain barrel or a rain garden is worth a certain amount of money as a tax credit in your area. So check into that. I think in Stevens Point, it's $50 for a rain garden and $25 for a rain barrel. So it's not a lot of money, but it's something as a financial incentive. So this is the rain garden that pipe led into. And it's already downslope from the house. So any water that flooded into here, if it filled up all the way, it would go farther from the house. It would not back up toward the house. And you can see the big clump of blue flag iris here in the foreground. And there's some common mint and dewberry and jewelweed and a bunch of actual wetland plants there at the bottom. And then we have the flat top aster, and we've got purple coneflowers and black-eyed Susans and cup plants and things up here on the top. Back behind this iris clump is actually where that pipe pops out of the ground for about 6 inches and dumps all that water in. So you don't even know it's there. The rain garden is doing its job and you can't even tell anything is happening in the background. So when I say native plant, I'm talking about one that naturally grows in your area. And usually this is a state level identification. So it's native to Wisconsin, native to Minnesota. You can get more specific than that and look for something that's genetically native to the Portage County or something like that. I typically look at them at a state level. And these are 3 examples: the cardinal flower, the Ohio spiderwort, and black-eyed Susan. There's a lance-leaf coreopsis in the background here. Those are all native plants and all good choices for rain gardens. So specifically on the upper edge, I've got some recommendations that I really like, that I've had good luck with on the upper edge, the mid slope, and the bottom of rain gardens. So I'll give you a few recommendations here. But something to keep in mind is that the upper edge and even the middle of a rain garden, the mid slope area, not the bottom, they're fairly dry. A rain garden is not a pond and it's not wet all the time. It's wet after a rainstorm, and then the water seeps through and it gets dried out again. So you do need to find plants that can tolerate a range of different moisture levels. And the upper edge is actually pretty dry. So whatever you'd plant anywhere else on your landscape, just in a foundation planting or in your yard, that's the sort of thing you want to put on the upper edge of your rain garden. So things like the nodding onion here on the left, the Ohio spiderwort in the middle, or the butterfly milkweed on the right, these are all excellent choices for dry areas, including the upper edge of rain gardens. Also on the mid-slope area, we've got a couple of coneflowers here on the left, the pale purple coneflower on the upper left. That's a state threatened species, but it is widely available in native plant nurseries across the state. And then there's the more familiar purple coneflower, which is native to most of the Midwest, but not quite up to where I am here in Portage County. I still use it quite often. It's a very valuable native plant throughout most of the United States, and brings in a ton of butterflies and birds and all kinds of things. So I use it a lot. In the middle here, we have rattlesnake master, which is a very unique plant. I have several of them in the rain garden really close to our sidewalk because I want people to notice it. It's a very attention-getting plant. and it starts conversations about rain gardens. So a very unique plant that I highly recommend. It has a big taproot, so it's able to seek water if it gets into a dry area. Below that is the wild geranium. That's more of a part shade species. So if you got a little bit of shade, a little extra moisture, that's a great species to add to a rain garden. And likewise with the columbine here on the right, same thing. It's a little bit of shade and a little bit of extra moisture is perfect for columbine. And that's a great species for attracting hummingbirds and hummingbird moths as well. At the bottom, there's a lot of different choices out there because you can put in prairie plants and wetland plants. There's a huge number of species that will be happy in the bottom of a rain garden. So in the upper left here, I have New England aster. This is a beautiful one. That's one of the last things to bloom in the fall. You see it along highway medians and ditches often in October, still blooming. We have bottle gentian here on the lower left, one of my favorites for that blue color. The Joe Pieweed here in the upper center. Below that is swamp milkweed with a sweet black-eyed Susan in the back. It's a little bit different than the common black-eyed Susan. Both of those are good choices though for rain gardens. To the right of that is blue flag iris, a wetland plant that many of you probably have along your lake shores or stream banks. The little sedge here is Bebb's sedge, B-E-B-B-S. It's a dainty, delicate little sedge, gets a couple feet tall and does really well in a rain garden. And then on the right is the meadow blazing star. That's Liatris ligulus stylus. So Liatris, or the gay feather or blazing star group, is known by a lot of gardeners. That particular species, the meadow blazing star, is amazing in its ability to attract monarchs in particular. It will attract other butterflies too, but there's something about that plant with monarchs in particular that just makes them go nuts. So that's always a good choice as well. In the title of the slide, I mentioned the tall floppies. So that's just a generic term I use for things that are kind of tall and unstable. So when you have a really high wind event or a large rainstorm, sometimes you get these very tall plants that flop over. And that's especially true at the bottom of a rain garden because the water moistens that soil. So you get this kind of wet, waterlogged, soggy soil at the bottom of the rain garden, and it loses some of its ability to stabilize that plant. And if there's a big wind event at the same time, it can push that plant over. So one thing you can do to get around that is if you have a very tall plant like that, you can actually cut it back in the early summer. So take a foot or a foot and a half off of the plant's height, and that will reduce the maximum height that it'll achieve later in the season. This is especially effective with things like asters. So New England aster is another one that I often do this with, and it creates a small bush instead of a much taller, more flop-prone plant. So it's something to keep in mind as a management tool if you want to have those plants in the bottom. All right, now I wanted to mention this list here. So these are a lot of the worst invasive plants that we deal with here in the upper Midwest. And what I'm going to do now is highlight the ones in red that we as gardeners have intentionally brought in and either released intentionally or they have escaped from cultivation and they've gotten into natural areas. And it's kind of a sad and disturbing slide, really, to me, that we spend billions of dollars managing these things in this country. And we pretty much brought all of them in ourselves, and most of them intentionally. So bottom line, let's try not to make this list any longer than it already is. It's plenty long. Regardless of what you choose, whether it's a native plant or a non-native plant, it could be from Asia or South America or Wisconsin, wherever it's from, you still have to figure, you got to put the right plant in the right place. Typical gardener's motto: if you put the wrong plant put the right plant in the wrong place, the conditions don't match up with the preferences of that plant, it's not going to do well. So you just have to keep that in mind with whatever species you choose to plant. Native plants are the best if you're looking to support pollinators and birds. If you're looking to improve water quality and shoreline stabilization, these native plants that have evolved here for thousands of years, those are the best ones that are most suited to our lake shores and stream banks. and to grow here in Wisconsin with our climate. The native plants generally require very little maintenance, so they don't tend to need any watering. Again, this is the right plant in the right place. If you put the right plant there, you might have to water it for the first month or two just to baby it along, get it established. But after that, it's fine. It doesn't need fertilizer. It doesn't need water. You don't have to go cover it if we're getting an early frost. These plants are adapted to these conditions that we have, and so they tend to need very little maintenance. And anything you want to achieve in a garden, whether it's accents or color drifts or borders or a variety of heights or bloom times or textures, all of these things can be accomplished with natives. You don't need to go thousands of miles away to find plants from across the world. All the plants that occur here right now can accomplish all of these things for you. So when you put in plants, do you want to use plants or potted plants, or do you want to use seeds? And these both have their advantages, but in terms of a rain garden, seeds do not work very well. And the big reason for that is that you're collecting water in a rain garden. You're having water flow into it. The water is going to pick up a bunch of seed, and it's going to redistribute it around the rain garden. It's going to push a lot of it to the bottom. It's just not an ideal way to start a garden in a depression situation. So plugs or potted plants are definitely the way to go. They cost more money, but they establish much, much faster. And I'll show you a couple of examples here. They require a lot less maintenance because they're big, strong, robust plants already. They're out competing weeds on their own, so you don't have to pull them all out. They do require a little bit more watering because you have a large plant now with a large root system and large leaves that are losing water. So they do need a little bit more watering, but the success of your rain garden will just increase exponentially if you use plugs compared to seeds. So let's make a rain garden here. We're going to start with this. We've got a flat landscape full of turf grass, like many developed lots. We're just going to dig a hole. We're going to take some soil out, get rid of that turf grass, and we're creating a depression now that we can direct some water to and allow it to soak into the ground. So the first thing that I like to do, this isn't an essential step, but what I like to do is grab some weed-free compost. We have an operation in Mosinee, about 25 minutes north of here, Busy Bee Compost it's called. They have bulk compost. It's a large commercial composting operation, and I can buy it by the cubic yard and take a trailer up there and get as much as I want. So I go up there and I get that, but you could use compost from your own yard. You can buy it wherever you might have a source for it, or you can skip this step. It's not essential to starting a rain garden, but I like to put a couple inches of that down, and then I mix it up with the soil underneath. So I create maybe an 8-inch zone of soil that's been kind of fluffed up, aerated a little bit, loosened up for planting. And then I put the plants in, and I always use plugs. I don't use seed at all in rain gardens. In the bottom, remember, you've got fairly wet conditions, at least after a rainstorm. So you can have things like blue flag iris and a variety of sedges and more wetland type species down there. But then as you go up, you're going to want to put in things that are more tolerant of dry conditions. The sweet black-eyed Susan or little blue stem or other things like that that are more prairie plants would work better along that upper edge. And then I typically use field stones. Around here, we've got tons of rocks that farmers don't want. So it's easy to find field stones. And I like to border rain gardens with those just to provide a sense of it sort of completes the garden, and it defines it, and it looks natural. So I like the field stones. And then you can either have water naturally running over the landscape if you have a little bit of a slope, or if you don't, then directing water from a downspout is the best way to get water to the garden, either underground or above ground, however it works for your property. Once you put that down, you're going to want to have some kind of a rock pad there so that the water flying out of the downspout or the underground pipe doesn't erode a big hole in the side of your rain garden where it rushes out after a rain. So put some rocks there that absorbs the energy from that flowing water and allows it to slowly seep down into the garden. One common misconception about rain gardens is that it's a pond. It is not a pond. The water stays in there for a matter of minutes to hours. And the other big misconception is that they breed mosquitoes. And I had one neighbor come over and tell me that when I was making the rain garden. Mosquito larvae, there's lots of different kinds of mosquitoes in Wisconsin. There's not just one species, there's many different species, but they all require at least 7 days in standing water as a larva before they hatch into an adult and start biting people and mammals. So if you don't have water standing in your rain garden for 7 days or more, you're not going to be able to complete a mosquito's life cycle. If anything, if you had water sitting there for a day or two, you might get some mosquitoes laying eggs in there, but the eggs are going to dry out and die, and you're not going to be actually creating any new adult mosquitoes. All right, so once you have all those steps done, you can throw your final touches down and you're all set, and you've got yourself a functioning rain garden. So what does this look like in real life? This is my rain garden that you saw at the very beginning. This is the day that we're going to get started. We spray painted out an outline of a path and a planting bed and a rain garden, and sort of mapped out our entire front yard. And you can see the rain garden there on the right side that is ready to be excavated. We do have a tractor in the road there. I had a landscaping contractor help me out a little bit with this project because it was a lot of soil moving. So that definitely sped up the project for me. But we have a rain garden that's designed to capture water from 1,100 square feet. That's between the garage and the house itself through one downspout. It's going to deliver all that water to a single location. And the garden is about 280 square feet, 15 inches deep in the center, and gradually sloping up each side. And it's designed as a butterfly garden. That was really our focus. But keep in mind that any garden, and especially a rain garden, can perform a lot of different functions at the same time. So not only are we cleaning all the stormwater off of our property with this rain garden, but we're also providing a butterfly and bird paradise. You wouldn't believe the birds in there in the wintertime when everything is in seed. There will be a flock of goldfinches or something in there for there'll be dozens of them in there at a time. And as we walk out the front door, there'll be this big flush of birds that come flying out of there. And then throughout the summertime, there's just butterflies and other insects in there all over the place. It's really providing an amazing habitat while it's also treating the stormwater. It also provides a privacy screen for our front porch from the road and from the neighboring houses. So it does a lot of things for us all at the same time. This is August 1st, the day that we got started. Here it is a few hours later when we kind of prepped the yard and mixed up the compost layer there and created the depression of the rain garden. And then here it is 2 months later. So these are all plugs that went in. These are potted plants that were anywhere from 3 to maybe 7, 8 inches tall when they were planted. Here's a big rainstorm. We've got about half the rain garden filled up with water. Some of the plants are blooming here. If you know some of these species, you might be saying, well, why is a black-eyed Susan blooming on October 1st or a purple coneflower? It's because those plants were actually in pots up until August 1st, or actually it took several weeks to plant all this. So some of them were in pots until the end of August. And so they didn't bloom at their normal time. They actually bloomed quite late because of being planted late. And here it is the following summer. So these plants are 10 months old at this point, or they've been in the ground for 10 months. And you can see these plants are doing really well. They're happy, they're thriving. All the other plants are in, the mulch path is in, everything like that. The rain garden's looking really good. And here it is about 1 year old, August 11th, we had a big rainstorm. And we had about 1.5 inches of rain in less than a half hour. So it came down really hard. You can see it blasting out of the downspout there and hitting those rocks. It filled up with water, filled up the rain garden all the way, drained out the opposite side. And if you were on the road or you were at a neighbor's house, you wouldn't even know that this rain garden is doing what it's doing. It's holding hundreds of gallons of water, maybe more than maybe thousands of gallons of water. But it just looks like a flower bed to most people as they walk or drive by. And the next day, here it is from the rooftop. You can see the overall rain garden shape here. All these plants are standing tall and proud. They're blooming. They're looking very happy. You can also see the downspout and the rock pad really well from this view. Plants, they took it in stride. They loved it. They got a little extra water and they're very happy in there. So as I said, ours is designed as a butterfly garden, mostly because my daughter really likes butterflies. I do as well. But you can see her here with her favorite butterfly, the monarch. And on the right is flower vases that we bought for all the adjacent homeowners in our neighborhood. And throughout the summer, my daughter picks cut flowers from the garden, the rain garden and other plantings, and delivers them to the adjacent neighbors. And we'd keep that going all summer. So if their flowers die, they bring the vase back and we cut up some new ones and we give them a new bouquet. So it's a way for us to share the beauty of the rain garden and the other plantings at our house with the neighbors and get them interested in some of these native plants and get them to come over and actually see it in person. All right. So now we're going to move on to gardening with Goggin. We've got Patrick Goggin coming up next. Again, he's part of our Extension Lakes team out of Rhinelander, and he's going to be talking more about shoreline edge gardening. Quick note about this picture here. This is one in downtown Stevens Point at Piffner Park along the Wisconsin River that I designed a couple of years ago for the Parks Department. And these plants here, again, are about 1 year old. And this was previously turf grass along the path, between the path and the river. So you can see plugs again, they're really fast. They succeed very quickly. We've got anise hyssop and cardinal flowers and some sedges and swamp milkweed, a lot of good plants in there. And they're holding that bank together really well, which the turf grass was not doing. The other thing they were doing was decreasing the goose population. Geese were really bad along the path. People were skateboarding and riding their bikes on the path and getting goose poop all over everything. And this is a way for us to reduce the goose population and also provide a beautiful shoreline there at the park. So I'm going to turn this over to Patrick. All ready to go, Pat?
Yep.
All right. I'll stop sharing. You can go ahead and start.
You seeing my slide okay?
Yep, it looks great.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, so a little overview. We're going to dig in deeper into these native planting best practices and how, along with rain gardens, they can be utilized along our waterways to enhance wildlife habitat and assist with stormwater management. And so we're going to just go through the history of why, how we got here in championing this best practice, and then take you through a native plant guide that we've developed with the Healthy Lakes and Rivers grant project that can be a roadmap to help you do this in your own situation. I think it can be helpful, though, to start with an intact, functioning, vegetated lakeshore area to understand what we're striving for in terms of the attributes and characteristics that we see with a healthy shoreland system along a waterway. The first thing you might notice is out in the waters, tree stumps, wood that has fallen into the water that has become standing habitat. This helps with erosion control. It provides spawning cover. It provides perching areas for aquatic insects to emerge and cover in general for those aquatic insects. We have emergent vegetation like the bulrush you see here. Those plants help intercept wave energy and dissipate it. They help also intercept sediment runoff that might be coming off the land and allowing that to settle out. And they provide important habitat for those baby fish, those aquatic insects and other wildlife in that nearshore area. And then moving up to the land-water interface itself, 3 layers of vegetation, a canopy layer of large trees. Up in the Northwoods, it could be even super canopy trees like the white pine poking out 50 feet taller. A mid layer of smaller trees and shrubs that provide habitat and intercept that rainfall that Paul talked about. And then a ground layer that consists of native grasses, sedges, rushes, wildflowers, ferns, a whole suite of native plants, and a duff layer, the shedded wood, the shedded leaves that come with a forested system. The duff layer and that ground vegetation work together to be a really important interceptor of that dirty water and also provide habitat. A lot of us, when we came to lake country, this was the kind of situation we might have first come to? A small cabin, maybe 800 square feet with 1 or 2 bedrooms in it and a pretty modest situation. The footprint would look like this. Maybe we're in a maple beech forest or some other kind of forest cover here in the North Woods, a gentle slope to the lake. Notice a grass corridor going to the water body for our access. The cottage isn't too big. Like I say, a few hundred, 700, maybe 800 square feet. We have a gravel driveway, and we have maintained the buffer strip at that land water interface. It's not to say that we don't have an impact of this development on the water. We do. It's 1,000 foot of runoff. There's a little phosphorus that comes from this footprint, and 20 pounds of sediment make their way to the lake. But part of the story to understand here is when we moved to this kind of situation, from a 700, 800 square foot house to more of a 4,000, 5,000 square foot situation, a full season type operation. You can see in the graphic there on the left that our ratios of runoff, the phosphorus, the phosphorus is the driving impact to that algal bloom and other challenges with nutrients. And then the last one, the sediment, all 3 of those have greatly increased when we've moved to this 4,000 square foot structure along our waterways. And so now we have 4 times as much phosphorus making its way off this system, and as much as 18 times as much sediment. And that can be really problematic for fish communities, for trying to maintain healthy algal populations and stay away from those harmful algal blooms, etc. And so you can see in our new updated 1990s type development, when we've moved to more of a 4,000 to 5,000 square foot type structure, we've really increased the hard surfaces along our lakeshore living. We now have gotten rid of that grass corridor and have lawn to the edge. We have a much bigger structure in terms of the rooftop and hardscape that goes with that house. And now we've also added a paved driveway and maybe even an outbuilding that has a hard top to it as well. And so we've increased the amount of impervious surface, that is hard surfaces around that water. And unfortunately, that decreases the ability for the site to intercept that dirty water and get it to a safe place. And so now we have runoff, 5 times as much runoff coming to the lake. We've moved from 0.303 phosphorus to now 0.2 phosphorus. So 5 to 6 times as amount of phosphorus. And then I noted the sediment has grown as much as 18 times with the amount being delivered. And if you add that development up across the lake, as we've seen in our National Lakes Assessment, the #1 stressor to our lakeshore systems and our stream systems too is the destruction of that lakeshore habitat. Those 3 tiers of vegetation have been denuded or changed such that we're losing that absorption capacity and ability to provide wildlife habitat. We've been studying this in Wisconsin for a while and know the challenges that come with this, whether it's the loss of songbirds that comes over time when we denude those shorelines, or things like green frogs when we get to 30 or 32 houses per mile just disappear from the landscape. Woody habitat starts to decrease, and so on. So the challenges we have related to this development pressure on lakes is controlling dirty water and nutrients, that phosphorus and nitrogen, from moving downhill to the water. Instead, we want to intercept it. We want to divert it into the woods and allow it to infiltrate safely. The other challenge and goal is maintaining and enhancing native vegetation along that land-water interface. And in that near shore area, letting those bulrushes or other native plants exist. And then as well, your upland portions of your property, paying attention to try and maintain as much native vegetation as we can to support wildlife. You can see in these pictures above, when we get challenges from those bigger hardscapes, we get rilling like we see in this driveway and access road. We get spotty grass growing in that land-water interface, and we can get exposed soil like we have on this shoreline here. The good news is we have a program that's about 7-8 years old, Healthy Lakes and Rivers Best Practices, that looks at 5 best practices that help shoreline property owners do stewardship activities to enhance that water quality and to benefit wildlife habitat. And we work throughout the land-water interface as well as into the upland part of the property. So we have 3 zones. We have an in-water zone. I'm just going to go to the previous slide here. We have the in-lake zone. That's where you might find that woody habitat, those bulrushes. We have that land-water interface, the transition zone. And then we have that upland zone, the rest of the property that impacts greatly the health of that water. And so we try to work with you through planting at that land-water interface that is contiguously at least 10 feet wide and totals 350 square feet in some shape, way, or form. And you'll see on the Healthy Lakes and Rivers website, there is a native planting guide for this native planting that coaches you through 6 different kinds of plantings we might embark on our shoreline property. The fact sheet for the native planting also goes through the costs that are associated with these plantings, some of the materials needed, do you need a permit, the timeline, and things like that. You can find this fact sheet as well as this companion guide on the Healthy Lakes and Rivers website right here and get a copy of the guide there. So let's go into this guide and these 6 planting options. So we have lakeshore edge, butterfly and bird, bare soil or erosion control, low growing, deer resistant, and woodland. So lakeshore edge is pretty straightforward. This is the land-water interface. Here's our lake. Here's our array of native plants that we're going to utilize. For every one of these 6 planting options, we provide you with a plant list. So for example, this is the plant list that goes with one of the options, and we have a dry and medium list in terms of soil moisture, or if you have a wetter scenario, a moist and wet soil. Now, sometimes the challenge is we have both of these scenarios along our shoreline, so we can use both of these suites of plants sometimes as part of our endeavor, but usually we're going to have one situation or the other in terms of the tendencies of that site. And so we're going to go with a dry medium soil if we have more of a sandy sugar soil that dries out pretty quickly, or maybe we have more of a wet foot situation. I'm going to go with that list. But as you can see, we have these different options. So this is the bare soil option. What this is meant to do is deal with some of those erosion controls or that situation where we have exposed soil. The low growing option is utilized. It was mentioned that in Paul Stevens Point project that they had geese as a challenge with that park system. Well, we can use this suite of low growing vegetation that doesn't really get higher than your knee, but also provides the habitat, the solid roots, and the stabilization along that shoreline that we're looking for. At the same time, it provides a deterrence for those water birds like the geese making their way up onto the shore. Some of you out there may be in country where you have deer pressure or rabbit pressure. So we're going to use some plants that we know can resist some of that browsing. And so perhaps the deer resistant list is for you. And then some folks are more interested. We have a shady situation. Maybe we have a big red pine or a white pine dominating our shoreline and have a shade situation that we're dealing with. Let's utilize this suite of shady scenario plants that can be utilized along the shore. For every one of these native planting options, we follow the shoreline habitat state standard, which has 3 components. You can see in brown, green, and red, the components are woody. So 1 or 2 woody plants in the form of tree or shrub. We have a grass and sedge and rush component, which is in green, which we want to see as many as a third to half of the plants utilized in that way with our planting, because those are the workhorse species that stabilize that soil and really hold it along the shore. And then a suite of wildflowers and maybe a couple ferns mixed in. These plants are, again, providing that food and habitat for critters. The plant lists try to use a suite of plants that can work within anywhere within Wisconsin. These plants are plants that, like I say, are good at working hard along our shorelines to protect them from erosion pressures. At the same time, they provide habitat for the critters that utilize these near shore areas. This is a picture from the Chicago Botanical Gardens where they've restored over 4.5 miles of shorelines along their waterways there. And one of the things that they do is through those plantings is you can see these perpendicular to the shore little clumps of vegetation that they use, even starting out here into the shore and then working their way back into the land and water interface and to the upland. These different polygons of native plants, if you will, perpendicularly laid out along the shore, help protect that shore and provide the deep roots and the structure that can stabilize that shoreline. Roots like this, swamp milkweed. Look at it after 1 year of growth, how much roots there. One of our native asters, blue joint grass. Some of our caryxes here at top. This is fox sedge, Carex stipata, and porcupine sedge. Look at the massive root structures. This is native blue vervain. This is the ox-eye daisy after 1 year, and this is the black-eyed Susan. So again, the roots of these, we don't see it in this picture, but the roots of these plants are doing the heavy lifting of stabilizing the shore and providing that wildlife habitat. We have some maintenance involved with these sites. Sometimes we put up temporary fencing for 3 to 5 years with T-posts and plastic webbing fence that can be up with zip ties for, like I say, 3 years or so. You can use other deterrents like the garlic-based liquid fence or the blood meal-based plant skid, but the idea is to mix up the routine of maintenance and protection that you do there. You'll also need to be watering these plants over time, at least initially. As Paul said, just to get those plants established, it can be helpful for them to get a drink of water to an inch and a half, 2 inches every week as they get established after the initial planting. Here's some of the nuts and bolts with the grant. You can find out more on the on how this grant system works if you're interested by looking at the fact sheet around the grant that is on the Healthy Lakes and Rivers website. The frequently asked question fact sheet is on that website and coaches you through these parameters, the due date of November 15th and the rhythm of life with that grant. You can certainly contact me one-on-one via email too if you want to dig deeper into what the grant provides. All this information is on the Healthy Lakes and Rivers website. To date, we have put in over 585 of these native plantings, as well as you can see the other 4 best practices we championed through this grant initiative: fish sticks in the water, and then those upland practices, rain gardens like Paul described, rock infiltration, and diversions, which are used to intercept that stormwater and get it safely tucked away back on the landscape. We also are remembering some of the teachings that Doug Tellamy has shared with us. These native plants not only are important from a wildflower point of view, but those woody native plants are very important early in the season, helping pollinators get through that early part of the growing season. When we put these plantings in, one of the things we often see and coach people to perhaps think about is putting little cues to care in with the planting to help neighbors as well as family members maybe just understand why we're putting in this suite of native plants, as well as it can just break up the view, moving from the lawn to the native planting itself, and just help people understand that these native plants have a purpose, that they're doing some heavy lifting when it comes to water quality and wildlife habitat, and they're doing good things for our lake. Just to show you what some possible candidates can look like for this kind of planting, you can see here these two shorelines, nothing in terms of that 3 layers of vegetation that were talked about. Yes, they've left a few trees here on this property, for example, but no shrub layer, just lawn to the edge. And so 2 examples of really good candidates where perhaps we can put a little 350 square planting on one side of one of these houses, for example. Here's another example from a condo area. This example, you can see the water just coming down off the roof line here and coming through this area and causing some challenges here. This would be a great site for a rain garden, and perhaps even diverting some of that water before it gets to the rain garden, or again, maybe enhancing an area around this outdoor seating area with a native planting. Certainly bars and resorts could, even trailer parks could be possibilities here. Here's just an example of a trailer park that happens to have its own access area. Well, nothing going on here except help getting water to the lake that's dirty. So maybe we have some good opportunities up here for diverting water, and then a rain garden or native planting on either side of the fencing here, perhaps, that could be utilized to enhance conditions. I'm just going to end with, I will send to Katie a list of native, all sorts of materials related to building a program around doing this kind of work from the ground up. Within the PDF that I will send Katie to share with you, there's going to be lots of information around gardening with these native plants and landscaping with these native plants along the water's edge. So if you want to dig deeper, know that we will share those resources with Katie and the team and make sure that you're connected to them. With that, I just want to thank everyone for being a champion for healthy lakes and rivers. You know, we even got the governor's mansion to do a project like this through some of our lake leaders and through a great partnership of different folks, where we put the native planting in phase 1 back in this fall. So if the governor can do it, why can't we? So I encourage all of you to check out the Healthy Lakes and website here, where all this different information in terms of fact sheets and the guidebook are available, and dig in deeper to opportunities to do this work around your lake or river. With that, I think it's time for some questions.
Great, thanks, Pat. It looks like Paul and yourself were answering questions as they kind of came in through the chat, and that's great. One that we didn't have addressed, though, is for Pat. And could you comment, please, on the use of fiber logs and shoreline restoration?
Yeah, so-called fiber logs, some of them are made out of coconut, some are made out of more of a central hardwood type product found here in the Midwest. But the best scenario really for using those biologs or fiber logs is for in quieter backwater areas where maybe you have some undermining of the bank, where that log is tucked in. It is duck-billed anchored securely to the shore, and then you hit the lip of that site with native grasses and sedges and other native plantings to get reestablished. And what the use of the fiber log is for is it helps maintain that site for 5 years so that those plants can get established and get that bank restabilized. And so they can be a nice short-term tool to help with protecting that shoreline as those native plants get established. A great place to chat about learning how those might work in your area might be dropping by your Land and Water Conservation Department. They often have folks with technical expertise that can help you understand how to use a tool like a fiber log.
Great, thank you. The next question we have is, what are some good ways to address the elevation change when replacing a seawall along the shoreline?
I'm not sure if I understand the nature of the question in terms of when you take a seawall out, often what you're going to do is try to regrade it to a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1 slope that's more gentler and less steep. And then native vegetation would go as part of that that restoration as well.
I think that answers the question. One person was wondering about if they're going to do some restoration, but have to get rid of some invasive species first. How do you get rid of yellow iris?
I'm going to let Paul talk about the specifics of getting rid of yellow iris, but I'm just going to echo the importance of site preparation when it comes to doing these native plantings. If you have an invasive species on your site, I cannot underscore how important it is to deal with getting that invasive species out before you conduct your native planting. You'll just make your life easier in general. And even if that takes an extra growing season for you to do the site prep that's needed through black plastic or other site prep types of things, it's worth the extra time to take to do that because of the benefits of you'll get a much more successful project. With that, I'll let Paul, though, maybe give some specifics about yellow iris.
Yeah, sure. So yellow iris has a large rhizome network. So underneath the ground, it has horizontal creeping stems that allow it to spread in many directions. And that's what makes it very difficult to get rid of. I have seen successful projects where they've cut it off repeatedly below the water line if it's growing in the water itself, and that's basically starving the plant for the root system. And if you cut off all those straws, it eventually suffocates the root system and kills it. If it's up on the bank and it's not in the water, there are herbicides that can be used on the plant. You're going to want to use something that is formulated for aquatic use, like rodeo. Rodeo is a glyphosate formula that is much like Roundup, but it's safe for use around water. It is a challenging plant to get rid of. I would say cutting it back is probably the best non-chemical option. Digging it out can be done, but that will destabilize the shoreline as well. So that's another thing to keep in mind. I saw there was a quote from Scott, or a comment from Scott in the chat, that he has yellow iris on the shoreline, but it does seem to preserve the shoreline. And is it possible to leave it in? Sometimes you will cause more damage by digging it out than you will just leaving it in. If it was my shoreline, I would cut back the yellow iris repeatedly or mow it and plant some blue flag iris right next to it. Try to just slowly convert it to a blue flag native iris instead.
Great. Our next question is for either Paul or Pat. And someone was wondering, what do you think are the barriers for lake property owners that aren't doing this already? Is it mostly financial or time, or maybe a lack of education?
Yeah, I think it's all of those things. One of the biggest things I've heard from people directly is that they just don't know where to start. And I would highly recommend getting involved with a local Wild Ones chapter. If you have one, pretty much everybody in the state has a nearby chapter. I was a past president of our Central Wisconsin chapter here. And one of the biggest things we focused on was just kind of walking people through how to start a new native plant garden. What kinds of plants would be good to start with? Really versatile plants that will pretty much succeed anywhere for anyone. Site preparation, we do demonstration garden tours and prairie tours, so people can see anything from a 100-square-foot garden to a 50-acre prairie and hear about how other people have done it, learn from their mistakes and their successes. So that's a really strong recommendation from me to get involved with Wild Ones. Time and money certainly is a factor as well. I would recommend starting small. People sometimes get overwhelmed because they try to bite off too much at one time. I would say start with maybe a 50-square-foot or 100-square-foot garden and have that for a couple of years. And when you're pleased with how that worked out and you've learned a couple of lessons along the way, you can take those lessons and apply them to expanding it to a larger garden. But start small. Read up on it, talk to other people who have done it, get some tips and tricks from other people, email me and Pat for some ideas. And I think that's the best way to move forward.
Just to add, one of the ways to start in some communities, it can be really important to get one or two people, maybe that are willing to be a local champion, a local provider of resources. So someone who maybe sat through this workshop here today and is starting to connect to the resources that we'll share with you. But having a local champion that can be a go-to for people who have questions about the best practices and how to use them. Just having that person at the local level to call and phone, even if they don't know the answer, and they can call someone like me or Paul to dig in deeper and get the answer, that can sometimes bring people to doing these work. Another idea is to start perhaps with a demonstration site on your lake. Maybe you have a county park. Maybe you have an island out in the middle of your lake that can be used for a site. Maybe you have a landowner who's willing to use a demonstration site on their property. But start with one project, small, like Paul says, do it really well, and then use that demonstration site to inform and educate your landowners about the project or the best practice and how it can work. One of the reasons demo projects can work is it takes some of the scariness away of what the projects look like when they're in the ground by showing them physically what the restoration looks like. The other thing, adding those cues to care, adding clumps to the way you put those plantings in, and just paying attention to making it look strong and visually pleasing are all ways to bring some of the scariness out of this. The other option is you can also just put the lawnmower away and let plants come in on their own naturally through the seed bank that is there. The challenge there is to watch out for invasive species that also can find their way into your no-mow area. But no-mow can also be a way to start the process of healing a shoreline and moving in the direction of encouraging native vegetation.
Great, thank you. A question for Paul. Do you suggest adding mulch to rain gardens as part of annual maintenance?
I do not. If it was a rock mulch, it would work out okay, but you can't really put wood mulch into a rain garden because the wood mulch, it tends to dry out during a dry period, and then it will become very low density and it'll float when you get it filled with water again. So the rain garden is going to fill with water, all your mulch is going to float at the top. It's going to cover your plants with mulch, weighing the plants down, causing them to collapse. It really becomes kind of a mess. So I don't use any mulch in rain gardens. I plant typically at 12 to 15 inch spacing between plants. And so at the end of the first season, they have grown together very well and they outcompete weeds very well on their own without the need of any kind of mulch or other weed suppression technique.
I guess
Great.
I would just chime in too that those native plants will create their own mulch over time, that duff layer I talked about. And if you just let that build up over time, you're going to create your own healthy duff layer around those native plantings that also has great benefits.
Okay, Patrick or Paul, do you have any advice on finding local nurseries that are familiar with native species and invasive species?
I just posted a long list in the chat for some ideas around the different parts of the state.
You can also go to the Healthy Lakes and Rivers website under resources, and there is a PDF of the native nurseries of Wisconsin. That is a listing of the native nurseries we know about in the state of Wisconsin that offer plant material. The other list that's also on that part of the Healthy Lakes and Rivers website under resources is a list to restoration consultants who help coach people up and help create designs and plans that go with this kind of work.
Okay, do you have any ideas for those with seawalls and limited buffer area? Maybe some sort of ivy or planter box? Not sure exactly where that question is going, but I think just ideas for those with seawalls.
Yeah, the seawall, it sounds like the seawall is not going anywhere. And can we get something growing over the top of that seawall? Maybe that's less, that makes it look more visually appealing, I think is part of where the question is going. You know, we have some native vines like the native clematis, which has a white flower, the virgin's bower. We also have a rock clematis. Down near the water, you might see more of the wild grape or other vines, but maybe a vine like that might be something to plant right in front of it and it'll drape out over the top of the seawall. Likewise, maybe some of those grasses, clump-forming grasses and sedges right in front of that seawall at the land-water interface would help. But a plant like those vines would actually creep out over the top of those that seawall and maybe hide it a little bit for you.
Great. And I just want to throw it out there. We are at the end of the webinar time, but Paul and Patrick very nicely agreed to stay about another 10 to 15 minutes to answer a couple more questions. So if you have to sign off, that's okay. We will be sending out a copy of the recording later. Our next question is probably for Paul about rain gardens. If you start small, can you add on later, or would that mess up the original configuration of the rain garden?
Yeah, if you wanted to make a rain garden larger later, you could do that. You could just take one side and pull it back, or you could expand all the sides, I guess, if you wanted to, and make it a new shape. Certainly, if you had a design going into it and you were trying to provide a specific design or certain color drifts or something like that, you would mess that up if you were to change the size and shaping of the garden. But I would just take that as an opportunity to take what you've learned over the last year or two and incorporate that into a new design. One of the coolest things about native plant gardens is that they are dynamic, and every year they're a little bit different. And the plant that you put over here is going to show up over there next year. And it's just constantly changing year to year. So I don't feel like it has to be the same each year. It's okay to make some changes and change the size or shape if you'd like.
Great. And our last question, it looks like here, is that someone would like you to reiterate, Paul, the resources you use to minimize your basement wall seepage. Was it just a rain garden?
Yeah, so what we ended up having to do, what happened was there was a kind of a compacted layer underneath our patio was a big part of it. And so the patio itself was draining a little bit toward the house, and the water that seeped through the patio blocks was also hitting an impermeable layer in the soil that was sloped toward our house. And so we took the whole patio apart and we lined it and sloped it back away from the house again, and also took all that water that would normally pour out onto the patio and we ran it through those pipes down to rain gardens. So that entire source of water was eliminated from going near the house, and it dried up the walls within weeks.
Great. Those are all the questions that came in. Paul or Patrick, do you have any closing thoughts for us at all?
Get out there and plant.
Yeah, I think starting small, find a few species that are highly recommended, or easy things like purple coneflower or smooth blue aster or some blazing stars, butterfly weed, swamp milkweed. These are all pretty easy to grow. They're easy to grow from seed. They're easy to grow as plugs. They provide a lot of color and a lot of benefits in even a very small garden.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for coming today. Lots of thank yous and mentionings of how valuable this was today. So we appreciate everyone's attendance, and we hope to see you at our next winter water talks about semi-aquatic mammals that live in and around rivers and streams and lakes. So thanks everyone.
Preface my comments.